Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the lecture of Prof. Kamper. Can I please ask you to rise as we welcome the procession inside the venue? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Please be seated. Welcome to the Faculty of Engineering. My name is Wikus van Niekerk. I'm currently the Dean of the Faculty of Engineering, and we also want to welcome our online visitors who are dialing in from all over the world. In particular, I would like to acknowledge and welcome our rectorate member, who is Professor Subisiso Moyo, who is the DVC for Research, Innovation and Postgraduate Studies. We also have Professor Bertie Fielding here, who is the Dean of Science. We have Professor Celeste Viljoen, who is the Vice Dean Teaching and Quality Assurance in the Faculty of Engineering. And we also have Professor Japie Engelbrecht, who is the Chair of the Department of Electric and Electronic Engineering. And also, of course, our honorary speaker, Professor Herman Kamper. And he's also joined by his wife, Helena. Baie dankie dat julle hier kan wees. En sy ma, Francine, ons ken mekaar al vir jare. Baie dankie dat jy hier is. And I'm told that Professor Martin Kamper, who's the father of Professor Kamper, is joining us online because he's attending a conference in the US, even though he's supposed to be retired. So, Martin... Hey, dis seker nou nie so vroeg in die oggend nie, maar welkom hier by ons. I also want to acknowledge our past rector and vice chancellor, Professor Wim de Villiers. And Wim, I'm sure you're here representing the data school this afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. We also want to acknowledge other colleagues in the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering, the Faculty of Engineering and Science, and I think there are even colleagues here from the Faculty of Economic and Management Science. Thank you very much for supporting your colleague here. And then also all friends, collaborators, students, both being here in person, and also then those of you always have to inform you that please turn your phones onto silent. And if you need the restrooms, it's out that door, out the next door, on the main spine to the left, and on the left-hand side you will find both the men's and the ladies. So we are here this afternoon for the inaugural lecture of Professor Herman Kamper. He is a professor of electrical and electronic engineering at Stellenbosch University. He obtained his PhD in informatics from the University of Edinburgh in 2017, focusing on unsupervised speech processing using Bayesian and neural models. After his PhD, he completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Toyota Technology Institute in Chicago, where he developed multimodal machine learning models that integrate speech and vision. Professor Kamper conducts research on machine learning, specifically focusing on speech processing. His work centers on developing methods that enable machines to learn spoken language autonomously with minimal supervision. This is similar to the problem faced by human infants during early language learning. They acquire language mainly from speech in their surroundings, and by trying to mimic this in machines, Professor Kamper hopes to gain new insights in both machine and human learning. His work is internationally recognized. He is a Commonwealth Scholar with 3,500 citations and an H-index of 31 on Google Scholar. He has received several awards for Best Paper, including the International Speech Communication Association Award for the best journal paper, and you have to focus now, the best journal paper published in computer speech and language from 2016 to 2020. So for 5 years, the best paper in that journal. So I think that's absolutely phenomenal. He received a B rating from the National Research Foundation in 2025. He has served on the organizing committee of the Deep Learning Indaba and is currently a member of the editorial board of the IEEE Open Journal of Signal Processing. So Professor Kamper, we're very happy that you are here at Stellenbosch, and we're very happy that we could promote you to the rank of full professor. And this is your opportunity to address all of us and tell us what are you doing here in your field of specialization.
Thanks a ton, Vikas. Yeah, I think I was telling Elena the last time I was this nervous was on our wedding day, which makes no sense, but anyway. Yeah, it's a real honor and a privilege to be able to share a little bit with friends and family what we work on and why we work on these things. So I hope it kind of makes sense at the end. Yeah, so I'll start with a little story. In the Second World War, radio played a really big part. It allowed generals and their troops to communicate over really vast distances. The problem with radio, of course, is that anyone can actually listen in. And so to deal with this problem, what they did was they developed encryption devices to scramble the messages. The most famous encryption device is the Enigma, shown here. And how the Enigma would work, it's that mechanical device at the bottom. The operator would sit, they would have the original message, and they would start to type it out on this mechanical device. Little lights would light up saying, you pressed an A, map that to a Z. You pressed a P, map that to a B. And then the scrambled message would be transmitted via Morse code over the radio to the other side where it would be decrypted. Okay? It was transformative technology. The English listening in, at least initially, couldn't figure out what the Germans were talking about. They did eventually crack it at Bletchley Park. Now, when the Americans joined the war, they were fighting in the Pacific, these islands that they were trying to clear out of Japanese soldiers kind of one by one. And these islands looked very different from flat Europe. And so they had their own encryption device, but they very quickly realized that this was not going to cut it in these type of conditions. Where it's like this dense, you're trying on your mechanical device to type, it didn't work, it was too slow. So they came up with a really clever solution. There was a Native American tribe called the Navajo, and they were keen to contribute to the war, so many of them signed up to be soldiers. And what the Americans then did was each platoon would get a Navajo soldier, and this soldier would just phone up their buddy in the other platoon and give them the message. The Japanese listening in was like, this isn't Morse code. They were freaking out a little bit. And so, according to the Japanese, they never cracked the Navajo code. These are two of the Navajo radio operators. They became so important that each one of them in a platoon had a white bodyguard to make sure that they were protected during the battle. Okay, now, what I want you to imagine is that you're a Japanese interceptor on one of these islands. You are sitting and you're listening to these radio broadcasts between two Navajo soldiers day by day. And all you have is the speech between these two soldiers that you can listen to. And my question to you is, would you be able to learn the language that's being spoken just from the audio, just from the speech that you're hearing? Okay, I'll simplify it a little bit. Maybe I wouldn't ask you to learn like what a word means. That's maybe too difficult. But could you figure out just in that stream of audio, where does words start and end? And if this is a chunk of word that you've identified, could you figure out that, oh, this thing occurs here and here again, some other parts of the recordings? Maybe even going a little bit further, could you figure out what are the sounds that's used in this language? What are for instance, the number of vowels, the types of vowels, the consonants? Does this language use clicks, like some of our Bantu languages? Is there more than one click that means something different depending on the use case? And my question is, could you figure this out just by being exposed to speech audio in this language? Now, these problems of word discovery and the discovery of acoustic units, the phonetics, the fine-grained stuff that makes up a language, this is really what I've been working on since the start of my PhD. And, okay, it's not actually me sitting there listening to these things. What I want to do is actually build a machine that can do this. And I draw a little robot. It's not an actual robot. It's actually a computer algorithm that we want to expose to speech data. And from that, we want it to learn on its own autonomously the structure of the language and what is going on. Okay. Well, that was like 4 minutes. So the rest of the talk, I will try and convince you that this is an important problem and that spending 12 years on it is not a waste of time. Okay. The first thing when I explain this to someone, they normally tell me, well, at least you know where words start and end, right? So if I'm bombarded with speech, at least I know when I type a WhatsApp message and I ask you what are the words, even if it's a language that I don't know, I can just look for the spaces, right? And at least we have that. Turns out that in speech, and this is a little bit astounding, there's very few pauses between words. Okay? People normally don't believe me, so I will convince you of this, or try to. This is a speech signal. Here at the bottom. At the top is a spectrogram. I won't explain that. You can go and watch my YouTube videos. If you look at the speech signal there, how many words do you think is in that speech signal? Just think to yourself. I'll walk away from the mic. I'll help you a little bit. Can this thing point? Okay, it doesn't point. Yeah. You see the pointer? That is a silence. I'm helping you. I'm teaching you. That's a silence. In the spectrogram, quick systems and signals lecture, it's like this black band. Okay, that's happening there. There's a silence. How many words do you think is in that sentence? Okay, so this sentence is 3 words. It's the words, I recognize speech. Okay, could you hear that? I recognize speech. Okay, and okay, now you tell me, you liar. You told me there's a silence there. You remember the silence that I pointed out? So that is the silence when I say the word speech. When I make the speech, there's a moment where my whole vocal system is closed off and there's a small silence before you get that explosion. Also see that the S from recognize and the S from speech is actually one sound that's kind of glued together in that blob. So it's a very difficult problem. Just figuring out where words start and end is non-trivial. Use a second utterance. How many words? Now you've learned. That silence there is probably not where a word boundary occurs. Okay, actually this time it is. But it's actually the silence before the B sound. So beach. I recognize beach. Okay, so this is a really difficult problem. I worked on word discovery, doing this in an unsupervised way for my PhD, but I won't say anything else about this. For the rest of the talk, I will actually talk about how we can discover the small units of language, like the speech sounds, and specifically representations that capture, like, what are the little sounds that make up a particular language. Okay, now I want the machine to do this, and another criticism could be like, hey, machines can do this already. When I speak to my phone, when I do a Google voice search, and I say a sentence, it basically writes out the text. So that model does know about words, and it probably knows about spaces and so on. And that's completely to speech recognition has come a really long way. But these systems, like Google Voice and so on, is trained in a very different way from the systems that I described. So what Google does is they collect thousands and thousands of hours of transcribed speech audio. So they get speech audio, they record English, and then they carefully have someone write out what are the words that's being said in that sentence. And then they train, normally a very big neural network model, to map from the speech to the text. You're telling the model what to look for. And this is called supervised machine learning. Supervised machine learning says, this is the input, this is the output. What we're interested in is for the model to learn these things on its own, to find structure in the data without explicitly telling it what to look for. And this is called unsupervised machine learning. It's a really difficult problem. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Okay, this is so difficult that maybe you could ask, is this actually impossible? Maybe a machine cannot do this, where we have to tell it what to look for. There's currently no machine learning system on Earth that can do this. But there is actually one system that we know of. There's one system, and the system diagram looks like this. Okay, so a human infant is a miraculous language learning machine. Okay, you can put them in any linguistic environment, in any country on Earth, and they can be exposed to any language, and they will, if they're a healthy child, acquire that language. A 3 or 4-year-old is a very good speech recognizer. This is one of our systems. This is our second system. The second one is training much faster than the first, but something about being a girl, I don't know. I do think it's worth just sitting back and thinking how miraculous that is. So a child is born. They are exposed to these signals in this very unfamiliar world. They're bombarded with unstructured data. They can't read, right? There's no text, there's no supervision. And from this sensory exposure, they acquire language. To the extent that a 4-year-old can ask me, Papa, what is this ball in your neck? He discovered this yesterday. Or questions about God, right? A 4-year-old. And I think that is like truly spectacular. Okay, and my goal is to mimic parts of that process in machines. And what I want to do today is to tell you why you would do that. And there's going to be 2 parts. The first part is going to talk about the scientific reasons for doing this. And I'm just going to show you one example of a scientific study that tries to use machine learning to understand how humans do this better. Okay, so machine learning can inform studies about how humans acquire language. And then the second study is going to flip it and say, I'm basically going to tell you about one study where we used models that were inspired by unsupervised learning to solve new engineering tasks, to build new speech technology that wasn't possible before or wasn't built in that way, and that was made possible by looking at this scientific problem. These are my simple definitions of science and engineering. Science I really see as exploring creation. That's the goal of science. And engineering for me is shaping creation, stewarding or co-creating. And I think these 2 things, exploring creation and stewarding creation, are the 2 things that humans were made to do. Okay, so topic number 1, the science bit. So here I'm going to talk about how machine learning and how machine learning models can hopefully help us to understand how children acquire language a little bit better. Okay, there's a lot of whys in this talk, but I'm talking to a mixture of scientists and engineers, so it's important to say why. Okay, first of all, the scientists in the room, they are perfectly happy by saying there's this phenomenon, a child acquiring language, that we do not understand, and there's value in trying to uncover how that works, and there's value in that in itself. You can't say that to an engineer. An engineer needs to have a reason, something that I'm going to build with this thing. So let me quickly talk just to the engineers. Why is it important for an engineer to know how a child acquires language? Because we have ways of building these systems with supervision already. Why waste your time making the problem artificially more difficult in order to understand how children do this? Okay, so a 3-year-old human, this is one of our system, has been exposed to roughly 30 million words. There's big variance on this. They're 3 years old. They've been exposed to speech. They've not seen any word boundaries. Very little explicit supervision. The human body works on between 50 and 100 watts of energy. So if you basically extrapolate that, then you get that to train a 3-year-old is 1.6 megawatt hours of energy. If you compare that to GPT-3, GPT-3 has seen 100 billion words. It's the equivalent of a 10,000-year-old. It's seen text with word boundaries. It's implicit in its tokenizer. And the energy to train is 1.3 gigawatt hours. So it's important because we have an example of a system that can do this way more efficiently than any current system. That's why we need to understand this and learn about it. Okay, now to understand the methodology that we will follow, I need to give a brief lecture on cognitive science. Okay, and cognitive science is a very big field, and the specific area of cognitive science that we use is computational cognitive science, and I'll explain to you one methodology that's used in cognitive science called the reverse engineering methodology. And this is if you have a very complicated system that you're studying, then you can use or try to use this methodology. And how this is going to work is you've got your human learner that we know can learn language from exposure to some stimulus. And what we will do is we will build an artificial learner, expose it to the same stimulus, in this case unlabeled speech without transcriptions, and we will try and get that system to learn, okay, from that data. And then in the end, we will compare the two systems. And we will see, does the artificial learner, the little robot, does it make the same mistakes as the human learner, the infant? Is it different? What principles should I build into my robot in order for it to acquire language? And if we can do that, if we can figure out what are the principles that we should build in for it to learn language, then hopefully we can start to uncover some of the principles that are used in humans. And I will show you one study where they basically do this. To unpack that a little bit more, what we're going to do in this computational cognitive science framework, and you do need to pay attention here, you need to stay awake for a little bit. I won't have any equations, but you need to stay awake. I'll have check marks. There's a check mark. How this works is, what you're going to do is you're going to have a bunch of models. These are artificial learners, and each of them will have different principles that they employ for learning language. Then you will have a bunch of infant studies, things we've observed, developmental psychologists have observed that we know infants do. Then we will compare, for instance, the first model to the first study and see, does this model exhibit the same behavior as what we see in the psychological study? If it does, it gets a check mark. It is important to say that we don't want this model necessarily to perform well. We want this model to perform well on stuff that the infants perform well on, but also bad on things that the infants struggle with. Okay, so we want both of these. We'll compare that model to infant study number 2 and infant study number 3, and then we have our second model, and we compare it to studies, and so on. And then you build up this matrix, and from this matrix you can say, okay, model number 1 has the most support from developmental psychology as implementing some of the mechanisms. It's not perfect, there's no such thing as a perfect model. But model number 1 has the most evidence. And then we can maybe go and investigate what happened in that study 3, what's different, what's wrong. Maybe the developmental psychologist messed up. I hope this makes sense. Okay, so the specific study that I'm going to talk about was done by one of my good friends, Yevgen Matusevich, and he basically built up one of these grids with different models and different infant studies. Okay, so what we need is models. Okay, and then we will also need infant studies. But let's first talk about the models. So we want machine learning models that can learn without labels. We don't want to tell it what it needs to look for. We want to learn in an unsupervised way. You will need a little bit of signal processing. I'm really sorry. But this is the only numbers, I think, apart from the slide numbers. Okay, so how any speech system starts at the bottom is we break the speech signal up into very small windows, normally 20 milliseconds long. And then what we do is we take the fast Fourier transform, basically, of that little snippet. That just tells us what is the frequencies that make up that little snippet of audio. What is the notes that make up that little bit of speech? Okay. And you encode these, basically, components into a list of numbers like this, which we call a vector. Okay, so if you've seen a vector. These vectors are very nice. They capture what happens in that little bit of speech. But it also captures a bunch of stuff that we do not want it to capture. Things like the background noise going on. Things like the channel conditions, the characteristics of the microphone. Things that our human ear is actually really good at abstracting out. And what we want is we want a machine learning model that can do that same type of abstraction to get to the core of what's going on, to get to the core sound the phonetic unit that happens in that thing. And we want to do that without supervision. So we're going to train models where we don't give it text, it needs to learn on its own. One of the oldest models to do this is called an autoencoder. And so what this model does is it takes that blue thing and it just tries on its output side to predict that same vector. But somewhere in the middle it has this smaller vector, the red one, and you can kind of think of this as a zip function that you have on your computer. You've got a Word document, and then what you do is you zip it, and the zip file becomes smaller. And then when you unzip it, it gets bigger again. Okay. The one difference here is that this zip function is lossy. And what that means is that when you unzip, you need to throw away some information. But that's actually what we want. What we want is we want this neural network to retain the phonetic content, the speech sound that happens there, and chuck away all the useless stuff that we don't care about, like background noise, maybe even who's speaking. We wanted to throw away these things. So this is an autoencoder. In my PhD, I proposed a very small extension to an autoencoder called a correspondence autoencoder. I won't explain it, but if you see CAE, that's kind of the model I developed. I hope this makes sense. You could also say, like, maybe I shouldn't zip just this 20 millisecond thing in isolation. And I should emphasize this whole zipping thing, this model, it's a neural network that gets learned on a lot of data. So you expose it to data, but you don't have to give it labels. You just tell it, this is what comes in, predict that same thing on the output side. Learn the zipping operation. We could say maybe we shouldn't zip just 20 milliseconds on its own. Maybe we should zip a whole chunk of speech together, and maybe the context can help us do that better and actually abstract away the useless stuff even better. So this is one model that does this. It's also an autoencoder, so its input is also the output that it's trying to predict, okay? But it's trying to encrypt a whole bunch of 20 millisecond things together into one red vector. I proposed a small extension to this called this neural network is called the autoencoding recurrent neural network. Okay? I proposed a small extension because we like writing papers. So in a different paper, I proposed an extension called the correspondence autoencoder recurrent neural network. Okay. I won't explain that, but cool. Okay, we've got models. Awesome. These models can learn. We can expose it to speech unlabeled in the way that an infant does. We need some infant studies to compare these models to, and then we can make a comparison. So what do we know about infant phonetic learning? I'm a little bit scared to go through this slide because there's experts here and online, but hopefully I can tell you something interesting about this. So what do we know about how humans acquire language, and specifically what happens in the early years? Okay, everyone wake up. It's going to take a bit of mental capacity. There's this fascinating study by Patricia Kuhl and colleagues where they compared English infants and Japanese infants. Okay. Now in English, there are these two sounds, the R sound in rock and the L sound in lock. They mean two different things. Rock and lock is not the same word. Wrong and long are two different words because of that difference in that first unit. Turns out in Japanese, these things are you can swap the one for the other, and it doesn't actually change the meaning. So if you have Japanese friends, adults would sometimes struggle to hear the difference between rock and lock, and actually articulate it differently as well. Swahili speakers as well have the same thing, that they actually make the rock-lock mistake. To us, this sounds weird. Like, how is this possible? But for Afrikaans people, we struggle with f and th, like, I'm trying to come up with examples, but you know, fit and fit. No, that doesn't. Okay, but f and th is difficult sounds, but to an English speaker, it's just like there, and it's a similar type of thing. So what Patricia Kuhl and colleagues did was something fascinating. They took 6 to 8 month old infants, two groups. One group English, growing up in American homes, and another group growing up in Japanese homes. And at 6 to 8 months, they tested whether these children, the Japanese children and the English children, can distinguish between rock and lock. Okay? And on this graph, higher is better. And what you see at 6 to 8 months here American children and Japanese children are approximately the same in distinguishing rock and lock. Then what they did was they tested these same children at 10 to 12 months later. And what they saw was that the Japanese children got worse in distinguishing rock from lock, while the American children got a lot better. This should blow your mind a little bit. So what happened was a 6 to 8 month old could distinguish rock from lock, growing up in a Japanese home. And then at 10 to 12 months, they got worse in doing that. Okay? And this study has been taken as evidence for a lot of things, but it's very clear that infants latch onto the language that they are exposed to. So this will be one of our infant studies. What we're going to do is the following. We're going to take one of the models that I described. We're going to train that model on English. And then we're going to test, can that model distinguish between rock and lock? Then we're going to train that same model, but a different one, only on Japanese. And we're going to see, can that model distinguish between rock and lock as well as the American model? Does that make sense? Just nod, okay. Okay, so this is one of our studies. Turns out this phenomenon has been documented for many other languages. I gave the Afrikaans example, but in Mandarin there is a contrast that's meaningful in Mandarin, this consonant. But in English it's approximately the same, and in Catalan there's a vowel that is a meaningful contrast, but in Spanish it's not. And these are going to be our other studies. Okay, so we're going to do English, Japanese, test it on English, Mandarin, English, test it on Mandarin, Catalan, Spanish, test both of those models on Catalan and see if it can distinguish these sounds. Okay, does anyone have a burning question? I won't take questions now, but there is a burning question when you see a graph like that, which is, how do they know what a 6 to 8 month old knows, right? So the answer is they gave them a written test and then, okay. No, so Japanese infants are different. Okay, I'll just play a short video of how they know, and this is just one method that developmental psychologists, developmental psychologists, this is just one method that they use to test very young children. I hope the audio works.
The infant sits on their mother's lap in the testing room. Across the table from the mother and infant, an experimental assistant sits and quietly shows the baby toys to keep him or her entertained and focused straight ahead. In the background, they're being presented with sounds. But after a number of repetitions, the computer operator in the adjacent control room pushes a button on the computer to indicate that it's time to change to a new sound. You teach the child to turn their head every time you detect a sound change. There's a training phase where every trial involves a change from one sound to another with the immediate activation of the reinforcer. Then there's a conditioning phase where you gradually delay turning on the reinforcer, hoping that the child will make an anticipator. Then after they've reached some kind of criteria, we have 3 consecutive anticipatory head turns, then you go into the testing phase. And in the testing phase, what happens is the computer operator puts the whole...
I hope that makes some sense. I'll just play the last bit of the video again. Just check what happens here. So the child has heard ba, 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 da. So the sound changes. Quickly check, they hear da and they turn their head before the toy starts playing. And that's how they can only accomplish this if they know the difference between a ba and a da. Okay. She starts speaking, so just pay attention to when the toy starts.
And in the testing phase, what happens?
Okay, so that child knows the sound, the, and that's how they test these infants. There are other ways as well. The eye tracking experiments have become really popular, or checking how quickly a child sucks a dummy. These are the type of things that they can conclusively use to know when a child has actually learned a contrast between two sounds. Okay, so we've got models. Awesome. We've got infant studies. And now Yevgen is going to compare these two. So he's going to check on these 3 studies, how well does different models do in matching what we see in infants. Okay, so this is the first model. I won't explain the model. It's called the Dirichlet process Gaussian mixture model. What you do need to know on this slide is that lower is better. And with better, I mean more accurate. Okay, so it's better at distinguishing rock from lock on these slides. So in the white bar here you've got the white bar is a model trained on English and tested on English. The black bar there is a model trained on Japanese and tested on English. Lower is better, which means that the English model performs better than the Japanese model on the rock-lock distinction. And so this model mimics what we see in infants. It matches the results that we see on infants, and the stars means it's statistically significant, which Yevgen spends a lot of time on making sure that there's an actual difference between the 2 models. So this model, if you go back to this slide, gets a tick for one of the studies that it matches that. If we look at the other studies, the Mandarin study and the Catalan-Spanish study, on Mandarin we also see that the native model, the white one, does better than the non-native one. And so again, this model, the DPGMM, does fit what we see in infants. But on the Catalan study, that doesn't happen. Okay, so this model, there's a small difference, but it's not statistically significant. So we can't actually say that this model for sure shows the same behavior as an infant. Okay, next model is the autoencoder. And the autoencoder, you can see on the English study, whether you train it on English and whether you train it on Japanese, it has about the same, it has almost exactly the same performance in distinguishing rock from lock. And side comment here, the autoencoder actually does way better than the Dirichlet process Gaussian mixture model. Right, the scores are better, but it doesn't match what we see in the human studies. So this one gets 0 ticks. Okay, next the CAE. Here we see that the English study does match, statistically significant, but the Mandarin and the Catalan study, we don't see any difference. The autoencoding recurrent neural network, here's something interesting. So in this study, on the English one, we do see a difference, but it's in the wrong direction, statistically significant in the wrong direction. So this one gets a very fat red cross, okay? It's not right. And then the last model, this is my one. Yes. And I was, okay, so it does well on English and Mandarin. And for the Catalan one, for once, I was very happy that statistical significance told me there's actually no conclusion there. Okay. It's not that important. I think the important thing I want you to get across is this idea of comparing what a machine learning model does to an artificial learner. And if you take a step back here and you look at what happens here, there's actually 2 models that's kind of tied, the DPGMM and the CAERNN. And I think this is cool. This is interesting in itself. It's cool that Yevgen did this. But the question is, can we actually use these models to help us to see what infants are doing? Can we actually use these machine learning models to inform studies in developmental psychology? And so what Yevgen did right at the end of this paper, which I think is like the coolest thing that he could do, was the following. He took the 2 leaders, the DPGMM and the CAERNN, maybe I'll keep this up. He took the 2 leaders, and in all of these studies, the models were tested just on one contrast, rock-lock. But there are many, many different sounds in languages, right? I could have taken the example, you get the point. Like, maybe there's something we don't know about how Japanese learners do, and maybe that's also a contrast that Japanese children struggle with. So I could tell the developmental psychologists, go and test this. Okay? And they spend a ton of money testing that, get ethical clearance, it takes 2 years, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And it takes a really long time to do that. So what Yevgen did was, he used the DPGMM to go through all of the different contrasts that you possibly can come up with, all of the different speech sounds, and he very quickly compared the English model to the Japanese model on every possible pair of speech sounds. This maybe took a day. I can't remember how long it took him. But it cost him nothing, apart from a little bit of electricity. And he did the same with the CAE-RNN. And then what he did was he came up with this table, which says if he had to give a recommendation to a developmental psychologist for what studies to go and spend money on to test, these are the speech sounds that the DPGMM predicts the biggest difference on. And for the CAE-RNN, these are the sounds that the CAE-RNN predicts the biggest difference on. Now, developmental psychologists haven't done this yet, but if they did, I think it would be an excellent validation of this type of approach of using machine learning to inform a scientific question. It will also help us tie the break between these two models, because then you can go and test it on specific sounds where they make different predictions. Okay, that is the end of the science bit of the talk. There's many other things I could have talked about, but I just gave you one snippet of one study that I find very convincing as a way of using machine learning to inform scientific studies and looking at these scientific questions of how infants acquire language. The last part of the talk, and it will be much shorter, will be about how models that are inspired by how humans learn language, specifically unsupervised speech models, how that has enabled speech technology in ways that it wouldn't have been if no one was looking at unsupervised models. As a community, we could have just gone on and worked with supervised speech recognition, input-output, because that works pretty well. But by looking at things from kind of the side angle, I think we've been able to develop technology, engineering technology, that we wouldn't have been able to develop otherwise. This is the last model, and this is the model that has enabled a lot of the subsequent speech technology that we are using today. It's called Hubert. It's not that important. It was developed by researchers at Facebook, Meta, but the lead author on this paper, Wei-Ning Yuso, he came from MIT, working in a group that had a long history of looking at unsupervised speech modeling. And very quickly, how this model works is you have the speech stream at the bottom, and then what you do is you mask out. You basically say, that gray bit, you're not allowed to look at that, okay? And then what you have is you have this transformer model, it's a type of neural network, and you try and predict that masked out region. And the idea is that if you can do this, if I can give someone a sentence, blank out the middle bit and ask them what's going on in that middle bit, a model that's able to do that actually knows something about the language that it's exposed to. And so this is a transformer model, and this is the model that I will use as my example of where an unsupervised model can lead to new speech technology. This model is trained without any supervision, right? You're just masking out chunks of speech and asking the model, please predict those masked out regions. It is important that the transformer is something that really changed the whole field of neural networks. GPT, the T in GPT stands for transformer, and GPT is trained in a very similar way to predict the next word. And they took a lot of inspiration from that. Okay, so the technology that we're going to build with these infant-inspired unsupervised models is technology called voice conversion. Okay, now voice conversion is this task where I'm going to give some speech input, the blue one, and I want on the output side for it to have the same content, the same words, but it should sound like a different speaker, the speaker in green. Okay, so the system will have some examples of what it should sound like. I'll just play you some examples. So this is the input.
A narrow channel formed a passage through the ridge of rocks that protected it from the open sea.
Okay, we want to make that utterance sound like this.
Somehow, of all the days when the home feeling was the strongest, this day it seemed as if she could bear it no longer.
And we give the system examples of that speaker saying things like this, and then this is the output.
A narrow channel formed a passage through the ridge of rocks that protected it from the open sea.
Okay, and this is actual output from the system that I will briefly talk about. So that's voice conversion. Previous systems before we did our study, and our system is one of the best on earth, or was one at the time, was one of the best on Earth. But previous systems before ours, they looked like this. And I will now explain the first diagram. Actually, I won't. I don't know what is going on there. So it's extremely complicated. And so what one of my students, Benji, did one day, he was playing around with that transform model that I showed you at the start. And he was bored, as PhD students sometimes become. And he said, like, let me try and do something fun. That won't work, but I'll just try it. Okay? So what he did was he took that transformer model, and on top of that, instead of doing all of this, he applied the most simple machine learning approach that you can use. Okay? On top of the transformer model. So he took the model from Meta, and then he applied the most simple machine learning method that we teach in any introductory machine learning course. The method is called nearest neighbors. And how that works is basically you have some input and you find the closest thing in your training data set. I won't go into the full details of how this resulting approach called k-nearest neighbors voice conversion, how that works, but the system diagram is the circle. Okay, that's what the system diagram looks like. In a small follow-up, we proposed another approach called linear regression, which is the second most complicated machine learning approach that you can use. And we apply that again for voice conversion, and we call that linear VC. Okay, so it looks very different from this. Okay, it's very simple. And he didn't think it would work well, and that meant I ended up working on voice conversion, not something I actually foresaw ever in my life. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to play you examples of voice conversion input outputs, and actually also show you where these things can be used in a way that's not bad. The first example is pretty bad, but okay. I'll play you output.
Okay, colleagues, I believe we can all agree that Mrs. Herman deserves a salary raise.
Okay, if you don't, you can chat to our dean afterwards. Because, okay, the input to the system was... Okay. Okay, it was me. Okay, it's a joke example. It's also serious. Voice conversion can be used for like bad actors, and so there's ethical concerns, and we need to keep these things in mind. And that's also why I have friends working on deepfake detection and support them. I think our system is really easy to detect. It sounds good, but it's also really easily detectable. The next example is one. So I don't want to admit this, but I sometimes listen to RSG, which is the Afrikaans radio station, and they sometimes have book reading, where someone sits and reads a book. And they've got good actors that then make up voices for the different characters in the book. And I thought this is just such a cool example where you could use voice conversion to actually generate different characters. And then you would have one voice actor reading the whole book, but you have different voices for the different characters. So I'll play you this output. The voice acting is really bad because it was me reading a piece of Afrikaans Harry Potter. And the one other thing I should emphasize is actually this model, the transformer model that's used here, hasn't seen any Afrikaans ever, but we're feeding it with that input and then telling it, please sound like this other speaker, and it's able to do that. It's a little bit cringy, but I will play it. So, okay.
Interessant om jou hier te sien, Professor Mechanical. En dan lag in die kat se rug en die kat sterk. Steede van die kat dan lag ek 'n vrou met 'n strenge voorkoms.
Hoe weet jy dit is ek?
Maar liewe professor, ek het 'n kat tog nooit so stokstyf sien sit nie.
Jy sal styf is hier die hele dag op 'n baksteen manier sit.
Antwoord Professor Mechanical.
Okay, there's some slight slurring there. That's not the system. That was the input to the system. It was just it's a long sentence to read without mistakes. Okay, I won't play you the input, but it's just me saying that whole thing. That's then converted to different voices. The second to last example is there was a student in applied mathematics who has a very severe stutter. And he wanted to make a video for his master's presentation. And so what he did was he actually sent a sample of his voice to a company, and they built a text-to-speech system for him where he could type out the script, and then the system would basically read back in a fluent voice, in his voice, but fluent. And I heard the system, and I'm like, this is rubbish, it's really bad. So what we did here was the student, he wrote out the whole script, and then I read the script. And then what we did was we had him read parts of Harry Potter with his stutter, and then we would voice convert from what I've read to his voice. And what the system would then do is it would latch onto the non-stuttered bits, and in that way generate a fluent output, because the input is fluent, in his voice. So I'll play you the output. Again, the voice acting isn't great. I mean, it was also a very technical master's, so the output is this.
Image captioning is the task of generating a short natural language phrase that describes relationships between objects and context within a given image.
I think I also had the flu, so there's a little bit of that coming out. I'll just play you the reference. So the reference is the data we got, which says, make it sound like this person. Okay, so the system latches onto the non-stuttered bits, and in that way it can produce fluent output. The last example that I will play is a project. Some of the people on the slide is here. This is a really cool project where we actually built standard supervised speech recognition systems for detecting language development problems in very young children. So this was a project for Afrikaans and for Xhosa. And we're just building standard systems the way that Google does. But the problem is if you're trying to process child speech, there isn't actually a lot of training data to build your system from. Even the input-output examples, there isn't enough. And so what Christian did in this study was he basically said, let's take some more adult data and then convert them so that they sound like a child. Okay? And then you have more training data to use in your system. And this made a very small difference, but it helped in specific cases. So what I will play to you now is, this is a short Xhosa utterance that was originally said by an adult. Okay, so this is the output of the system. Okay, so that's the input for that utterance is this. You can clearly hear it's an adult and the child. The conditioning information that we used here, the reference data, we didn't have Xhosa children to condition it on, so we actually used the British child. Okay, so the system gets this thing as the input, and then it says, gets this as input. And we say, please make it sound like this.
Ticket inspector.
Okay, and then the output is what you heard. Okay, that's almost the end of the talk. That's the end of the engineering part. Yeah, I think just taking this together, I hope I gave you snapshots. I could have spoken about many other things, but just two snapshots of one study that has a scientific motivation, and another study where we use things that we are heavily inspired by how infants do to develop new technology. So that's the science and the engineering of language acquisitions in humans and machines. Thank you very much. So I will go straight into thanking people, and I won't name everyone by name. I think it would have been maybe better if I did that for 45 minutes. But there are some names that I should highlight. So the first person I want to thank, I had this slide, about how electrical machine design and cognitive science is basically the same thing. But it took me 30 minutes to explain this. And the reason I have this slide is that my dad is an academic. He works in electrical machines. And so the first person I want to thank is my dad, Pops. It's a huge privilege to have an academic father. I think I am massively inspired by how he works with his students and the passion that he has, specifically for his students. It's an amazing example to emulate. One thing my dad did when me and my brother were 9 or 10 was, I don't know if this is legal, but he took some of the old lab computers, I think they were thrown out already, and he brought it home. And so this was the 386 that I got. My brother got a 286 because he's younger. And I think my dad is not a computer guy. He dumped the computers there and then he went and worked on the car, I think. But just that one simple thing, I think, kicked off a lot of the rest of my life and the interest that I've pursued afterwards. So thank you for that. This is the cover of the programming book when we were 9 or 10 that we learned programming from in QBasic. And the person that took us to the library to take out this book is, of course, my mother, Mums. So the next person I want to thank is Mums for everything you've done for all the kids. I think for also instilling a very deep work ethic in us, which has helped a ton. And my mother was also the one that taught us mathematics. And I think all four of us children have a love for numbers that we really get from our mother. So thank you for that. The next person I want to thank has a blank slide, because if I put up a picture of her, she would kill me. But Helena, thank you for everything. Sorry, I wrote stuff down for this part. Thank you for all the adventures across the world and now across Jungle Gym. And sorry about the sunscreen yesterday. I will remember tomorrow. Okay, the next people on my list is Micha and Fia. They're not here, so we have a bit of a breather. It's nice. But I want to thank them if they at some point watch this thing on YouTube. I want to thank them for giving us a second time to see things for the first time again. I think it's a huge privilege that parents have. The last people I want to thank, this is a blank slide, but it's a long one, is I've had a series of amazing supervisors, and I hope some of them are watching online. If some of you bump into them in the hallways, please tell them that I thank them. So Thomas Niesler was my master supervisor, and he really cares deeply about his students. It's an example that I really try to emulate, but he also played a massive role in setting off this whole route. I want to also thank Thomas specifically for teaching me how to write, which as a supervisor now I really appreciate the challenges of teaching students how to write. My PhD advisor, Sharon Goldwater, I want to thank you for showing me to dig for the right questions and for giving me this example of how to supervise students by at the same time giving them freedom to explore, but also nudging them along to make progress. It's a very difficult thing to do as a supervisor, and it's something that I very much try and emulate as well. And then Karen Levishku, my postdoc advisor, who's also had a really profound impact on my life. Thank you for still teaching me how to write. So Thomas didn't do a proper job. But thank you specifically for giving me the hope that there are academics that are really at the top of their fields, like really at the top of their fields, but are still genuinely kind human beings. I think it's very rare, and it's amazing to have that example to see. The next people I want to thank are all in my home department. None of them can be here. But first, electrical and electronic engineering is one of the best departments, if not the best, in the whole university. I think the only one getting close is applied mathematics. So it's a massive privilege to be in electrical and electronic engineering. Thank you to all my colleagues, many of whom are here. There are 3 names that I will just name by name. Pietri Meyer, for being an amazing mentor. Herman Engelbrag, he helped a ton, especially when I came back to Stellenbosch, and he really helped without expecting anything back. So I want to thank Herman for that. I've served under 3 HODs, and Herman, you are by far my second favorite. Okay, it's complicated. My dad was one of the HODs, so you can, and Jaap is the last. Okay, go and figure that out. The last person I want to thank from our department, sorry, I'm almost done. There's almost food. The last person is Johan Boysen. I think anyone in our department will not wonder why I thank you, which is why I'm thanking you. So Johan, for everything you do for us, thanks a ton. I want to thank students. I've had the privilege of supervising amazing students for their postgraduate studies, and I want to thank each of them for teaching me so much. I want to thank the undergraduate students, also some of you here, for the privilege of teaching you and for giving me genuine joy. It's a joy to teach you guys. As an academic, it's pretty awesome that you can have friends scattered across the world and like real friends. So to the friends and collaborators across the world, thank you for being part of my life. I don't have any collaborators who aren't also friends, so that's pretty cool. It's a unique thing, I think, to have people that you're like, oh, I have a best friend in Romania. And it's not a privilege, I think, that everyone has. And then the last one is I want to thank the community of Christchurch Stellenbosch, and specifically our growth group. Some of you here, I want to thank you as well. And that is the end. Should I stay here?
Yes.
Okay.
There's no one who's desperate for a question? No? From the floor? It was very clear. It was very clear. Okay, so if there are no questions, then I think I want us to really congratulate today, I think, our Professor Herman Professor Kamper for the lecture and for really trying to break it down for us so that we could follow. I think there are many people from different fields. So you have done very well in making us understand the lecture. So his lecture was on the science and engineering of language acquisition in humans and machines, and he has done very good illustrations, I think, showing how this can be done, moving from humans and baby humans, I think infants, and how they are probably the fastest learners that you can find. So that was a very good illustration. So at the university, we are really glad to have these lectures because for us, they help us to also give a chance to our professors to share what they're doing with the public, that's yourselves, and showing what they do in terms of the work, with the students, the mentorship part, but also collaboration. You've mentioned collaborations, and also, the outputs that come from that in terms of the impact of the work. So for us, it's really special that we can see this type of work being translated into what can be used, especially in early childhood development, but also the power of language, right? And what people already knew that, when it's easier to learn a language when you're still a baby, but it's much harder later, I suppose. But there could be exceptions, but maybe you can also do experiments on older humans in terms of how they learn and respond to that. So it's really special that you've done this. So we really want to thank you. And also, he's done quite a lot also in illustrating the different disciplines. I think if you look at where he started, the connection between engineering, linguistics, and then also artificial intelligence, and that you can actually apply these skills from the engineering. And I'm glad you mentioned applied maths, which is also my department. Are there any people from applied maths here? Oh, cool, yeah, I see Hugo and the other colleagues, yeah. So, and the fact you said that it was also one of the best departments, so that's news. So it's really exciting. But also to see that, the role that the mathematical sciences, the engineering sciences can play to improve the outcomes, especially in the social sciences where we try to look at, the behavior and how people learn. But also I think it has applications also in the health sciences as well. So we have a department for early childhood development, and I saw a former rector here who's the health sciences, Vim. Are you there hiding? Yeah. So I think some of the work, I think you can see that there are applications which go beyond just the engineering part. So that was really good to see. I also saw that according to Google Scholar, one of his oldest papers, which had a very high impact, and I think the dean did mention this, was the paper on participatory research for low-resourced machine translation, a case study of African languages. And it's really great to see somebody, I think already in 2020, yeah? So, which was a while ago, before we started talking about the buzzword in artificial intelligence, machine learning. But of course, the engineers already knew about this. It's just that now, of course, it's a big buzz. So you can check out his work in terms of that. I think that was very interesting. So just a few remarks. So in an era defined by artificial intelligence, his work and insights remind us that science and engineering are not isolated pursuits. They are deeply human endeavors, reflections of our curiosity, creativity, and desire to communicate. His contributions to the university and the academic community at large exemplify what we stand for at the university in terms of our values, demonstrating excellence. And also, I think he has quite a lot of compassion, and he's also a family man, so it was good to see all these combinations coming together. And so we really want to thank you for your contribution, and we wish you the best in your career as you move forward. You have accomplished a lot while you're still young, so I think you have many more years to accomplish much more, and we hope that you'll be our next Nobel Peace Prize winner. And so with those words, we just give him his certificate as a symbol that he has complied with this aspect of the journey, academic journey. And then I also saw the dean in your voice message there that you promised an increase. So.
Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Japie Engelbrecht. I'm Herman's third favorite HOD, apparently. Top 3. I just have one question. Where did you get all the training material to do the voice conversion for Vickers? YouTube, is that okay? If you'll allow me to just give a few words of thanks, I'd like to thank, on behalf of Herman, the staff from the Corporate Communications and Marketing Division for the arrangements and the recording and live streaming of the lecture. Specifically, we'd like to thank Amira Brown, Chuma Dakala, Krista Davids, Justin Alberts, and Jonathan Dale Blankenberg. Then we'd also like to thank the rectorate members who, for their time, for attending this lecture. I know you probably have to attend a lot of these, so we appreciate this. Fortunately, it was a very interesting one. So thank you, Prof. Sibusiso Moyo of the DVC Research Innovation and Postgraduate Studies, and Prof. Bertie Fielding, the Dean of Science. And also from our own faculty, we'd like to thank Prof. Vickers van Niekerk, the Dean, and Prof. Celeste Viljoen, the Vice Dean Learning and Teaching. And then also thank you very much to the Dean's office staff, specifically Ulrich Smith, Clinton Botha, and Jamie Sampson, for all the preparations to get the venues ready for tonight. Then finally, I'd like to thank our honorary speaker, Prof. Herman Kamper. Herman, it really is a privilege to have you in our department. You are an excellent teacher. You have a knack to explain difficult concepts, as we saw today, to your students, to your colleagues, and to the public at large. You are a dedicated supervisor. You treat your postgraduate students as colleagues and collaborators, which I really appreciate. You are a highly rated researcher who makes important and novel contributions to the field. And you are a friendly and supportive and kind colleague. and your positive attitude and your sense of humor really is a great asset to our department. So we love working with you, and thank you very much for giving us a glimpse into your research and for sharing your journey so far with us. Thank you so much. Okay, we would then like to invite everyone to join us for refreshments in the foyer. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Can I please ask you to rise as the procession leaves the venue? Thank you. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.